Right now, you can text someone across the planet in less than a second. Every book you've ever read, every contract you've ever signed, every text message you've ever sent, all of it traces back to one single moment. And that moment wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even intentional. 5,500 years ago, someone couldn't remember how many goats they owned. And trying to solve that incredibly boring problem, accidentally created one of the most powerful inventions our species has ever made. By the end of this video, you'll understand why writing, the thing making it possible for you to understand this sentence right now, started as something almost embarrassingly unglamorous. For almost the entire history of our species, humans had zero way to permanently record information. Everything, every deal, every debt, every promise lived only in memory. If you loaned your neighbor 3 goats, the only proof that debt existed was 2 people simply remembering it happened. No paperwork, no receipts, just trust, memory, and hoping nobody forgot conveniently. This worked fine when humans lived in small bands of 20 or 30 people. Everyone knew everyone. Reputation was permanent because you'd see the same faces for your entire life. Memory was more than enough. But then something changed everything. Humans started building cities. Around 10,000 years ago, agriculture allowed humans to settle down for the first time. Instead of constantly moving to follow food, settled life meant surplus food. Surplus food meant population growth. And population growth meant something the human brain was never built for. Strangers. Suddenly, you weren't trading goats with your cousin you've known your whole life. You were trading with someone 3 streets over, in a city of thousands of people you'd never met before, and would probably never see again. Memory-based trust breaks down instantly at that scale. You can't rely on, "I'm pretty sure he said 5 sheep," when the person could simply lie, and there's no way to prove otherwise. Early Mesopotamian cities like Uruk had a real logistical nightmare on their hands. How do you track who owns what, who owes what, and who paid what, when there are thousands of people and zero shared memory holding it all together? The solution came in the strangest possible form: clay tokens. Starting as far back as around 8,000 BCE, long before anything resembling letters existed, people across Mesopotamia began using small clay shapes to represent specific goods. A cone-shaped token might represent a measure of grain. A sphere might represent a jar of oil. A cylinder might represent an animal. If you traded 3 goats, you handed over 3 cylinder-shaped tokens. It was essentially physical. 3-dimensional counting, a system so simple a child could use it. And so effective it lasted for thousands of years. For an enormous stretch of human history, this simple token system was humanity's entire record-keeping. Technology. Simple, functional, and completely limited to just counting objects. Nothing more. As settlements grew into cities, and cities grew into trade networks stretching across huge distances, the humble token system started showing its limits. A single transaction might now involve dozens of different goods, multiple parties, and agreements that needed to survive being transported somewhere else entirely. You couldn't just hand someone a loose pile of tokens and hope they arrived intact and untouched. Tokens could be added. Tokens could be removed. Tokens could simply fall out of a bag during a long journey by donkey caravan. What Mesopotamian society needed wasn't a way to count. They already had that. What they needed was a way to seal a specific, tamper-proof record of one specific deal, permanently locked, so nobody could quietly change it later and claim it always said that. The solution was clay envelopes. Merchants would seal a group of tokens inside a hollow clay ball, then press a cylinder seal into the wet clay to mark ownership or authenticity before letting it harden. This solved the tampering problem beautifully. Once sealed, nobody could quietly remove a token or swap it out without visibly breaking the shell. But it created an entirely new, almost comically obvious problem. Once the tokens were sealed inside a solid clay ball, how could anyone check what was inside without literally smashing it open? Which, of course, completely destroyed the tamper-proof record you were trying to protect in the first place. You'd created a perfect vault with absolutely no way to check what was in it without breaking the vault. Someone needed a smarter fix. Someone came up with an almost absurdly simple fix. Before sealing the tokens inside, press the tokens into the outside surface of the wet clay first, leaving an imprint of each one. Now you had a picture of the contents stamped right on the outer shell. 3 cylinder-shaped imprints pressed into the clay meant 3 goats were inside, without ever needing to open anything at all. And then came the real leap, the one that changed everything downstream. If the outside imprint already told you everything you needed to know about what was inside, why bother putting the actual tokens inside the envelope at all? Someone at some point eventually skipped the tokens entirely and just drew the symbols directly onto a flat clay tablet instead. That single moment, replacing physical tokens with drawn symbols, representing them is, according to many archaeologists and linguists, the actual birth of writing. What did humanity's first writing actually record? Not poetry, not prayers, not declarations of love or war. The earliest known written tablets from Uruk, dating to somewhere around 3400 to 3100 BCE, are almost entirely inventories and receipts, lists of grain, counts of livestock, records of beer rations paid out to laborers for a day's work. One of the oldest deciphered texts in human history is, quite literally, an ancient accounting spreadsheet. Humanity's first ever written sentence wasn't "I love you" or "the gods are watching over us." It was closer to something like 27 jars of barley beer received. It's a strange thing to sit with. The foundation of every novel, every legal code, every love letter ever written begins with something this dry. At first, these early written symbols were pictographs, simple drawings that visually resembled the object they represented. A drawing of an ox literally looked like an ox's head, with 2 curved horns unmistakably sketched at the top. But pictographs have an obvious ceiling. How do you draw an abstract idea? How do you write down a number, a name, an emotion, or a concept like tomorrow or debt that has no physical shape at all? Over the following centuries, these pictures gradually became simplified and stylized, worn down through repetition into faster, more abstract shapes. Scribes began pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay using a cut-reed stylus, creating what we now call cuneiform, literally meaning wedge-shaped, from the Latin. Slowly and almost invisibly at the time, symbols stopped representing objects directly and started representing sounds instead. From picture to phonetic symbol is what unlocked writing's true power, and it's arguably the single most important cognitive leap in the entire story. Once a symbol represented a sound rather than a specific object, you were no longer limited to drawing things you could physically depict. You could combine sound symbols the same way you combine sounds when speaking, to write down literally anything language could express. Not just goats, not just jars of oil, names, titles, feelings, threats, prayers, abstract, legal concepts that don't have a shape you could ever sketch. This is the exact moment writing stopped being a specialized accounting tool and became something closer to what we'd recognize as language captured on a surface, flexible, general purpose, and almost unlimited in what it could express. And that's exactly what happened next. Within a few centuries of that shift, Mesopotamian writing exploded far beyond simple accounting, into nearly every domain of human life. Suddenly you could write laws and enforce them the same way for every single person, because now there was an unchangeable written record, instead of a ruler's memory that could conveniently shift depending on who was asking. You could write history, preserving events in detail for people who weren't there and hadn't even been born yet, instead of relying on stories that quietly changed with each retelling. You could write literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature on Earth, exists because a system built to count sheep eventually became sophisticated, enough to record an entire epic about mortality, friendship, grief, and the fear of death. None of that was the plan at the start. The plan was just don't lose track of the goats. Here's a detail that makes the story even stranger. Mesopotamia wasn't the only place this happened. Ancient Egypt developed its own writing system. Hieroglyphics at a remarkably similar point in history, seemingly independently. Centuries later, in ancient China, an entirely separate writing system emerged, again independently, again driven initially by record-keeping and divination rather than literature. And on the other side of the planet, with zero possible contact with either of those civilizations, Mesoamerican cultures also developed their own independent writing systems. This keeps happening across human history and societies, with no contact with one another whatsoever, which suggests something important. Writing wasn't a lucky one-time miracle. It was something close to an inevitable outcome. Whenever a society got complex, enough that memory alone stopped. Being able to hold it together. Here's something that might surprise you. For an enormous stretch of history after writing's invention, almost nobody could actually do it. Writing wasn't taught broadly to the general population the way literacy is today. In Mesopotamia, becoming a scribe required years of dedicated training at a specialized school, memorizing hundreds of complex, cuneiform signs through repetitive practice on clay tablets. Scribes occupied a genuinely privileged position in society specifically because so few people could do what they did. Knowing how to read and write a contract, a law, or a royal decree meant you effectively controlled access to information that shaped how disputes were settled, how taxes were collected, and how power itself operated. For thousands of years, literacy wasn't just a skill. It was one of the most valuable forms of power a person could possess, precisely because it was rare. Writing, it's worth picturing what actually being a scribe involved day to day, because it looked nothing like sitting with pen and paper. Cuneiform was written on wet clay tablets using a reed stylus cut at an angle, pressed into the surface to create the characteristic wedge shapes rather than drawn in flowing lines. Once finished, tablets could be left to dry in the sun for temporary records, or deliberately fired in a kiln to preserve them permanently. This is actually why so many ancient Mesopotamian texts survive today. In a strange twist of fate, when cities were burned down in ancient conflicts, the fires that destroyed wooden buildings often accidentally baked and hardened, clay tablets sitting inside them, preserving records that would otherwise have crumbled to dust over the following millennia. Destruction, in a strange way, became preservation. For a very long stretch of the modern era, all of this ancient writing sat completely unreadable. Thousands of tablets covered in mysterious wedge-shaped marks existed in museums and archaeological sites, with nobody able to understand a single word of what they said. The breakthrough came largely through a trilingual inscription, carved into a cliff face in Persia, known as the Behistun inscription, which recorded the same royal proclamation in 3 different ancient languages side by side. Scholars in the 1800s worked for years, comparing the 3 versions, using the languages they could partially understand to slowly decode. The ones they couldn't, it was painstaking. Decades-long detective work involving multiple researchers building on each other's progress. When cuneiform was finally deciphered, humanity gained direct access to voices that had been completely silent for well over 4,000 years. Ordinary people's complaints, love poems, business disputes, and yes, an enormous number of inventory lists suddenly became readable again. Itself was extraordinarily complex, involving hundreds of distinct signs that could each represent a whole word, a syllable, or a concept depending on context. Learning it took years of dedicated study. Eventually, in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean, a radically simpler idea emerged. What if, instead of hundreds of signs, you used a small set of symbols representing individual basic sounds and combined them like building blocks to spell out any word at all? This innovation, generally credited to Semitic-speaking peoples in the ancient Levant, is the ancestor of the alphabet, system used to write the very words you're reading right now. An alphabet with only a couple dozen. Symbols could be learned in a fraction of the time cuneiform required. And that single change, from hundreds of complex signs to a small reusable set of letters, is arguably what eventually allowed literacy to spread, far beyond a tiny specialized scribal class. What a human brain can do, there's a deeper layer to all of this worth sitting with. Writing didn't just change what humans could record. Research on literacy suggests it measurably changes how the brain itself processes information. Learning to read and write appears to reshape neural pathways involved in visual processing and language, essentially repurposing brain regions that evolution originally built for entirely different tasks, like object recognition. In other words, your brain right now, reading this sentence, is running on cognitive machinery that our species never specifically evolved for reading at all. It's borrowed circuitry, repurposed through cultural invention rather than biological evolution. Every literate human on the planet today is, in some sense, hijacking an ancient visual system to do something evolution never originally designed it to do. None of this should be taken to mean that societies without writing were somehow primitive or unaccomplished. Quite the opposite. Oral traditions in many cultures without writing developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for preserving enormous amounts of information, accurately across many generations, using rhythm, repetition, song, and structured storytelling techniques, specifically designed to prevent details from drifting or being lost over time. Some oral epic traditions preserved thousands of lines of detailed genealogical, legal, and historical information with remarkable consistency for centuries, entirely through trained memory. Writing didn't replace human memory because memory was somehow inferior. It succeeded because it solved a different specific problem. Coordinating enormous numbers of total strangers across a complex society, something oral tradition, built around trusted relationships and community, was never really designed to do at that scale. For thousands of years after its invention, writing remained the domain of a small, specialized elite. It took an enormous amount of additional historical development. Before anything resembling widespread literacy became possible, the invention of cheaper writing materials, simplified alphabets, and eventually the printing press each removed, a barrier that had previously kept writing locked away from ordinary people. When the printing press dramatically reduced the cost of producing written material, literacy rates across parts of the world began climbing in a way that would have been unimaginable to the scribes of ancient Uruk, who spent years memorizing symbols specifically because so few people ever would. The entire multi-thousand-year journey, from clay tokens representing goats to a smartphone in your pocket capable of instantly displaying any written text in human history, is one continuous unbroken chain, each link building directly on the one before it. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little, in a good way. Writing is arguably the single most consequential invention in human history. It's the reason you can learn something a person who died 4,000 years ago once thought, in their own words, rather than through generations of retelling. It's the reason civilizations could coordinate at a massive scale, pass down knowledge across generations without significant distortion, and build directly on each other's discoveries, instead of starting from zero every single time a generation passed. And it didn't come from a genius with a grand, sweeping vision for human communication and civilization. It came from tedious, unglamorous inventory management, from someone annoyed they couldn't remember how many goats they were owed, trying to solve an intensely boring practical problem. Almost every transformative human invention seems to follow this same underlying pattern. Not a sudden bolt of visionary genius, but a mundane, practical problem, solved just well enough that it accidentally changed everything, downstream in ways nobody involved could have possibly predicted. Think about how much of your own daily life still runs on this ancient, accidental invention, largely without you ever noticing it. Every road sign, every receipt, every text message notification lighting up your phone screen right now, every one of those small, ordinary moments is a direct descendant of a system, invented to solve an intensely mundane problem, keeping track of who owned how many goats in a growing Mesopotamian city thousands of years ago. The scribes who first pressed those wedge-shaped marks into wet clay had absolutely no concept that their solution to a boring logistics problem would eventually become the invisible foundation underneath nearly every human institution that followed: law, religion, science, literature, government, and now the device you're using to watch this video. So the next time you send a text message, sign a document, or read a book, remember what's actually underneath all of it. Not inspiration, not prophecy, not some ancient genius who set out one morning with a grand vision to invent language on clay tablets. Just someone roughly 5,500 years ago who was sick of arguing about how many goats they were owed and accidentally built the foundation of every written word humanity has produced since, from ancient law codes to the very words appearing on your screen right now. If your brain enjoyed finding out how boring the true origins of something this massive actually were, hit subscribe. There's a lot more accidental history exactly like this one still waiting to be uncovered.